Hi everyone, I'm Sophie. I'll be delivering a seminar on principled arguments for ABP. Before we get started, I'll note that this seminar is very brief and it's also highly reflective of the norms of my own circuit. So feel free to take all of its contents with a big grain of salt. My hope is that there is at least something in this presentation that's useful for everyone who watches it, but feel free to discard any advice that you consider inapplicable. So, what are principled arguments? There are, broadly speaking, two categories of argument that you'll make in debating. The first of these is the category of practical arguments, and practical arguments are consequentialist. Consequentialism is the moral theory that the goodness of an action is solely determined by the net goodness of that action's consequences, and utilitarianism is a subcategory of consequentialism. Principled arguments, by contrast, are non-consequentialist. So as I've written here, principled arguments regard goods for which consequences, at least some of the time, might be rightly sacrificed, things like rights or duties or freedoms. So principled arguments tend to revolve around rights and duties. Rights, for instance, to choice, to privacy, to democracy, to expression, to bodily autonomy, to self-governance, and so on. And duties of parents to children, of governments to citizens, of historically oppressive groups to the groups that they have historically oppressed, from promise makers to promise recipients. And it's worth noting that the duties of the parties I've listed in these examples are a lot more demanding than just the general moral duties that I owe to you by virtue of your being a person, for instance, the duty to respect your autonomy. These are quite special and demanding moral duties generated by the morally special sorts of relationships, for instance, parental relationships, that these people find themselves in. Principled arguments can also involve other putatively intrinsic goods, so things like beauty or the natural world, but they less commonly do. So one question we might have at this point is consequentialism, as we've observed, is a moral principle, and practical arguments, as we've observed, are consequentialist. So does that mean that in some weird way, practical arguments are in fact principled arguments? No. So the labels principle and practical in debating denote the subject of disagreement in the argument. So it's true that all arguments have some form of principled scaffolding, but in the case of practical arguments, we all broadly agree on the truth or relevance of consequentialism as a metric. We're just disagreeing about which team delivers the best consequences. But in the case of principled arguments, teams are in fact debating about the truth or relevance of the principle being invoked. So what do different principles aim to prove? I think there are, broadly speaking, three levels of ambitiousness to which principle arguments can aspire. The first is proving that a particular principle is necessary, or the flip side, that its absence would be unacceptable. And I think this is the sort of argument that you might make about principles including bodily autonomy or freedom of religion, for instance, which are principles that many people believe to be extremely important and worth sacrificing a great deal of consequences or practical good in order to uphold. So, for instance, in the debate that this House would ban surgeries designed to alter a person's racial appearance, opening government might argue, and with good reason, that these surgeries are racist, that they contribute to racist beauty standards. And opening opposition might say, well, even if that's true, people still have a basically unlimited right to alter their bodies as they wish and to author themselves in this way. And maybe these are the sorts of surgeries that we might be morally dubious about, but they're not the sorts of things that the state should step in to prevent people from undertaking, because people's right to bodily autonomy trumps even negative social consequences that might result. And of course, that argument might not be proven persuasively in the round. It might be effectively rebutted. But my claim is simply that this is, at least in theory, a good and persuasive argument that can be made well. The second level of ambitiousness, one step down, is just showing that a certain principle is a really good thing. We'd like to have more of it, but it's not necessarily an automatic debate winner or the kind of thing that we can trade off unlimited consequences in order to uphold. So I think speech probably falls in this category. Not everyone, but most of us, I think, accept that we don't have an unlimited right to free speech. I can't incite violence. A great deal of extremely offensive or degrading hate speech is criminalized. But free speech is a broadly very good thing, and restrictions on our ability to speak freely need to be quite robustly justified. Finally, we might just aim to prove in other contexts that a certain action is principally acceptable without proving that there is any positive obligation to undertake that action. For instance, in the debate, which I believe was the Belgrade partial double octo, this house believes that environmentalists should engage in radical, violent, illegal action, or some other formulation of that idea. I don't remember the exact wording. The government bench might want to explain, probably quite briefly, that this is a principally acceptable thing to do, given the circumstances environmentalists find themselves in. And it's going to be pretty hard for them to prove that there is a positive obligation on environmentalists to do violent acts. What they're trying to do is wash away the concerns of the opposition bench about certain negative externalities that these violent or illegal tactics might have. So, one difficulty we might encounter when considering what sorts of principal arguments to make or whether to make them at all is that all arguments, and by extension, all sides and debates, have some kind of principled scaffolding, but not all sides or debates have principled arguments that are worth making explicitly. And principled arguments can take a lot of time and effort to prove well, so judiciousness matters, and of course always matters in BP. Some tips in this regard are, I think, useful principles that are worth making explicitly are intrinsically valuable. They're also worth sacrificing at least some of your practical consequences for, and they aren't just impacts of practical material that you've proven elsewhere in the debate or that another team has proven elsewhere in the debate. So, for instance, I have the right to vote, even if I vote for bad things. I have the right to make choices, maybe not every choice, but a pretty wide range of choices, even if I choose things that make my life go worse. I have the right to express justified anger, even if doing so would be unproductive. I have the right to use reasonable force to defend myself from violence, even if I defend myself poorly. And I guess that last one depends to some extent on the jurisdiction you're in or what moral intuitions you have. But I think most people would say you have some right to self-defense, even if you don't execute your self-defense particularly well. So how then do we make, rebut, and impact principles? Firstly, the first thing we need to do is explain why the principle is generally important. And this might sound extremely obvious, but it's a step that a lot of debaters forget to take. I think a lot of debaters are quite fond of arguing by analogy when they make principled arguments. But the problem with that strategy, of course, is twofold. The first is that you are not grounding your principle in anything very robust. And the second is that it makes your principle quite easy to rebut. If an opposing team just points out that the analogy isn't true or isn't relevant, then you don't have a lot to stand on. So we want to try and explain why the principle matters in and of itself. So, for instance, if we were defending a policy that we think would expand the reach of democracy, we might want to explain why democracy is principally important. And one explanation for why democracy is important is just that the government has a huge amount of power over you and your life. The state and has a monopoly on violence. It's a small group of people who can seriously change the way that your life goes. And so the only reason that that really asymmetrical power relationship is justified is that you have consented to the governance of those people. We might also invoke a more instrumental justification for democracy. We might say, well, most people have a pretty good sense of what would make their lives good and what would make them happy. And democracy is the only political system that allows us to effectively collect and aggregate people's preferences about their own lives. And therefore, democracy has the best chance of constructing policy or constructing society in such a way that happiness or utility is maximized for people. And I think it's useful to kind of disentangle those different justifications for certain principal goods, because those justifications can be useful or not useful to you at different points in different debates. So, for instance, in debates where we're defending a kind of technocratic approach to a certain area of policy, so we're saying rather than, I don't know, environmental policy, for instance, being determined by everyone democratically, it should be determined by independent technocrats. So we're doing something that certainly at first glance appears undemocratic. We might want to say, well, actually, no, this is in line with one of the reasons why democracy matters. One of the reasons democracy matters is because we think in general, people are good at making decisions about what makes their lives go well. But clearly, in the case of environmental policy, which is very consequential and also very technically tricky, people don't have the correct information to determine policy effectively, or at least that's what you would argue. And therefore, the use of technocrats in that policy area actually upholds the kind of instrumental reason why democracy is valuable. So we want to firstly explain why the principle matters. Secondly, we do want to try and think of some analogous cases in which the principle is upheld. The purpose of analogies in principled arguments is to deploy an uncontentious moral judgment, or at least a moral judgment that is uncontentious in the context of that debate, in service of a contentious moral judgment. That is the principle that you are debating. So we want to try and think of cases in which we're trading off a similar amount or kind of practical good in order to uphold the principle. So if you're defending some bad choice that you're going to allow people to make, you want to think of other choices we allow people to make that have similarly bad consequences for their lives. And finally, we want to explain what the principle's impact in this specific case or debate is. My overwhelming piece of advice here is just to be as precise as you possibly can. And of course, that's true in all of debating, but I think a lack of precision is particularly fatal in the case of principled arguments. And that's because there are often a range of different rights and duties sort of floating around any policy. And not all of those rights and duties are going to be useful for you to point out and make an argument out of, because not all of those rights and duties are going to be exclusively enacted by your side of the debate. And you want to choose the rights and duties that help you win and don't help any other team in the round win. So if we take the example, for instance, of debates about increasing immigration from countries in the global south to countries in the global north. So let's say the debate that this House believes that developed countries should significantly increase their migration intake from countries in the developing world, or some other formulation of that idea. If we were to make the principled argument on government that countries in the global north have been unjust to countries in the global south, they've done colonialism, they've unjustly stolen and extracted resources from the global south, and so therefore this is a necessary kind of reparation, I think that is not a very persuasive argument for two reasons. The first is that it makes your principle entirely contingent on the practical half of the debate. So if this policy of increased migration doesn't actually improve the conditions of people in the global south, then your principle falls down. And the second reason it's not very strategic is because that principled harm can presumably be remedied in other ways, for instance, by giving more money to countries in the global south rather than increasing migration. So what we want to do is try and tie the principle to freedom of movement, I think, and explain why freedom of movement is so principally important and is the only kind of fitting form of reparation, because that is the policy that your side exclusively is enacting and that can't be counterfeited in by your opposition. So we want to make sure that's where the principle is located. So how do we rebut principles? I think there are broadly three grounds on which we can rebut them. The first is on grounds of applicability, the second, grounds of importance, and the third, grounds of contingency. So firstly, we can say that a principle is inapplicable. Yes, it's very important, but it's just not being violated in this debate in the way that this team is suggesting. And the first thing we might want to consider is whether our opposition, or the other team, I should say, sorry, I'm very 3v3 brained at the moment, whether the other team has just misunderstood the principle they're invoking. So one example of this is an argument that not very many debaters make, but plenty of people in the real world make, people who are free speech absolutists, who say speech is just so important that we should basically allow all of it, even speech that is hateful or violence inciting or deeply offensive to certain groups. Speech just matters so much that we need to have all of it. And what we might say to those people is like, well, why do you think speech matters in the first place? A lot of classical defenses of free speech would say that speech is important because it allows us to collectively reach the truth. But the sort of speech that you, imagined free speech absolutist are defending is not truth generative or truth uncovering, right? Like there's no kind of interesting or true propositional content in hate speech. And secondly, hate speech excludes its targets from participating freely or safely in public discourse, and so therefore reduces our chances of socially reaching the truth by accessing a wider variety of interesting perspectives. So we might say that a lot of free speech absolutists, though I'm sure not all of them, are operating off quite a thin and uninterrogated view of why speech matters in the first place. Secondly, we might consider how the principle ought to apply in this debate. So I think in the case of an argument about consent, for instance, we might say, yeah, sure, consent to this activity that we're debating matters, but you've just set the standard way too high. You don't need perfect consent to start a new job or to play a sport or to do whatever. We just need to prove a sufficient standard of consent, and that has been proven by us. The second way that we can rebut principles is by saying that they are just less important than the other team suggests. So firstly, we might say the principle is just outweighed by other concerns, by counter principles, or by practical arguments. Those things matter more. And the second thing we might say, and this is particularly useful, I think, if the team making the principle has just argued by analogy, we might say, well, your evidence for the principle mattering is just pointing to the way society is set up right now. So for instance, maybe you're defending people making a bad or dangerous choice and saying, look at all these other bad or dangerous choices that we allow people to make. But we might say, yes, that's an accurate description of what the world looks like, but it's not an accurate description of what the world should look like. Perhaps the state should infringe on individual liberty more than it does in order to ensure that people's lives go well. It's just that we at the moment don't enact what we think are good moral values through policy. Finally, we might rebut a principle on grounds that it is contingent on the practical side of the debate. We should be quite careful, I think, in making this response. The fact that other things also matter doesn't mean that a principle is contingent, nor are accusations of contingency a substitute for engagement. So be careful in this domain. Finally, then, how do we impact principles? Principles, of course, can be debate-winning contributions that get you the first. They obviously don't have to be. They can just be another important contribution that your team makes. They can raise burdens in terms of how well or to what extent practical material needs to be proven in order for a violation of a certain principle to be justified. They can break deadlocks, particularly in opening half if you're closing. I think principles can sometimes lock in practical harms and make them worse. Consent is a clear example of this. And finally, I think it's useful to consider how people react to a perceived principle violation. So democracy is principally important in and of itself, but it's also bad when people feel that their democratic rights are infringed on because, it makes them very unhappy. So the final thing that we might talk about then in this presentation is principles around consent. So one intuition that I have that I think a lot of people share is that the level of consent required for morally permissible X increases in proportion to X's potential harm, or I suppose to the potential harm of the non-consensual version of X, where that's a relevant distinction. Whoopsies, sorry. There we go. So if I want to borrow a pen from you, I probably only need to ask you once, and that's fine. But if I want to duel you to the death, we should probably talk about it a fair bit. We might want to sign contracts. We might want to be checked by a psychiatrist to make sure we're both of sound mind, talk about it with our families, etc., because, of course, the harms of dueling to the death are potentially quite a lot higher than the harms of borrowing a pen. And one corollary of this is that many accounts of coercion, if by coercion we are assuming that this is something that's really morally bad, something that the state or other external parties should at least sometimes step in to prevent, many accounts of coercion are going to be too broad. So firstly, is coercion influencing someone to make a choice that they wouldn't otherwise make? I think the answer is clearly no. Like if I pay you or offer you $100 to run around the room, I've influenced you to make a choice that you wouldn't otherwise make, but I don't think I've done anything immoral. I've just introduced a new factor to your cost-benefit analysis and made it beneficial for you to run around the room on net where it wasn't previously. Secondly, is coercion influencing someone to make a harmful choice? And by that, I mean a choice that is harmful to the person who makes it, that they wouldn't otherwise. I think, again, I'm going to answer no. And that's because in some cases, for instance, by way of example, people do dangerous or unpleasant work because they are coerced to do it by poverty, and they wouldn't do that work otherwise. And I think you can certainly say that poverty is immorally coercive, but I don't think the choice to undertake dangerous or unpleasant work is always the kind of choice that, for instance, governments or external parties should step in to prevent, though it sometimes is, but it isn't always, because in some cases, the counterfactual for people who do that dangerous work would be worse. It might be having no money at all, which can be, of course, more dangerous and more unpleasant, unless those governments are also going to massively reduce poverty in addition to preventing people from making the choice to work. So I don't think this is kind of a sufficient definition of coercion. Finally, is coercion influencing someone to make a harmful choice, by which, again, we mean a choice that is harmful to that person that they wouldn't otherwise make via the imposition of threats or pressure? I don't think it is. And to illustrate this, I'll use a very brief example. So imagine there's some guy who really wants to be an astronaut. That's his dream job that he's always wanted. And one day he gets a call from NASA and they say, congratulations, you're our newest astronaut. He's super excited. They say, you need to fly this rocket to the moon. He's super excited. He starts off his journey. And about halfway through, he becomes just paralyzed with fear. He realizes, I can't do it. I'm scared that if I get to the moon, I'll die. I have to turn this rocket around. I just cannot make this journey. And he's on the phone with NASA and he's saying, I'm really sorry, I have to turn the rocket around. And NASA's like, well, if you do this, we're going to fire you. You're not going to be an astronaut anymore because you signed the contract saying you take the rocket to the moon. And NASA in this case is influencing him to make a choice that is harmful to himself. That is the choice to continue flying the rocket to the moon, that he wouldn't otherwise make, via the imposition of a really substantial kind of threat. That is the threat to deprive him of his dream job. But I don't think NASA is doing anything wrong. They're just trying to get him to uphold his side of the contract. So again, I don't think that is really sufficient as a definition of coercion. One potential definition, which I'm sure has some problems, but I think works relatively well, is that coercion is the imposition of unreasonable threats or pressure. And that's how we distinguish this from the NASA case, which renders the coerced person an irrational decision maker. And the debating related upshot of all of this is that I think successful coercion arguments often require more proof than they're given. So they require proof of more than influence and a bad outcome. They require proof of unreasonable threats and pressure and of resultant irrational decision-making on part of the person who has been coerced. So that's my seminar. Best of luck to everyone competing at ABP. I'm sure it'll be a great tournament.